Oh, it's because it's probably the whole time. Just eat your own tiny areas.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on there.
Oh, okay.
Let's just read the question. Okay.
What is your understanding of...
Traditional ways to heal?
Honestly, I really don't know.
I'd say traditional ways to heal would very much involve the land. It would involve very, Indigenous spirituality.
Sort of using plants and using the land and using different things that are like through dance and movement and music. That sort of thing, that's the traditional ways. I think that's what I know.
So I think my understanding is one, having relationships with people that you trust in your community, understanding each other's backgrounds, each other's stories, things that people have gone through, and speaking with them, really listening and actually wanting to learn, and then sharing experiences.
What was the impact of colonisation on the mental health and well-being
Of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
I think the impact was huge. I think that we can't even really understand, being a white Australian, the full extent. But I do know that they are still suffering today.
I'd say it had a huge impact on their identity as people, on their connection to their land, connection to others, connection to their mob, huge impact.
And I think the violence and the mistreatment of people is less than just because they were different. I think that's really made such a horrible impact on Aboriginal peoples.
It's evident that there is generational trauma, so people are still being affected today from what has happened, 200 years ago.
What are the barriers to well-being and healing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
I think the history in this country provides a lot of barriers to people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The pain and trauma of what's happened throughout our history creates huge barriers as well to just well-being in general, but also the healing process.
How is suffering expressed? I'm not sure if there are many differences. I assume there are.
I'm not sure if it's kept quite internal or if people talk a lot about their feelings. Maybe they don't. I'm not quite sure.
My understanding is that often they don't express their suffering and will not seek help because there is a stigma regarding psychology and getting help.
Suffering's expressed through difficulties forming relationships, through physical pain and discomfort, through difficulties just feeling well and being able to function well in a person's life. I'd say that's how suffering can be expressed. Yeah.
What do you see as the role of psychologists in supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's well-being? So one, I do think we need more psychologists in rural areas. There's not enough. And so that's one thing, just getting people to even know that there is a need in some other areas outside of the big cities.
I think psychologists can play a really important role, and they can try to understand the culture and how people would like to be treated, whether that's things like eye contact or body language, but also like the understanding of how they see suffering or healing. That's really important. And psychologists can bring in their own knowledge of different mental illnesses and different ways to treat people and combine that with knowledge that they can learn from Aboriginal people, and I think if brought together, that can be really good. Yeah, psychologists can bring that empathy and understanding.
So I think it's very difficult for Indigenous people to seek out help and to want to work with psychologists. So I think it's really important for psychologists to have a culturally sensitive approach and to learn more about the techniques that would be suitable for them. So I do know that things like narrative therapy have been shown to be effective, and instead of using terms such as counselling, using terms that are appropriate for Indigenous people such as yarning, which they might be able to relate to better.
Lastly, how do you think the time spent with the Willum Warrain mob will assist with the growth of your professional practice competencies?
I'm really excited about the understanding that I will get of their practices and rituals and how I can best help them in a psychology practice in the future.
I think it'll be good for me to develop as a person, which will then help my professional practice.
Maybe also, in terms of working across the lifespan, I'm not sure, but it does seem to have sort of different generations there. So there's some like younger people more my age, and there was the elders, and so understanding that, and in that context even more so, because it does tend to have more of a distinction between different ages and different life stage, different times, different life stage times? That's not the word for it.
Fantastic. No, it's so we just capture it now and we'll
Capture afterwards.
Yeah, later.
Yeah, good.
Oh, so that will then have the contrast.
Yeah.
What we start.
What is your understanding of traditional ways to heal?
Yeah, we spent a little bit of time talking about that on the placement, just with the various staff members there. There's no one real easy answer, is what I've learned.
From what I've heard, there's a lot of community sort of healing. So when someone's going through a tough time, they might spend more time with their family and with their land. I heard a lot about, for example, also just getting in touch with culture. So there was one man that I spoke to who was going through quite a tough time, but once he found out that he had this community and that he was Aboriginal, because in that case he didn't actually know until he was like 15-ish, like mid-teenage years. As soon as he found out and then he had that community and that culture that he started learning about, he sort of felt himself getting a bit better and having a bit more meaning and purpose.
I think all those things all merge together, that you can't really have one without the other.
What was the impact of colonialisation on the mental health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
After my experience at Willum Warrain, getting a sense of how it is still affecting the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
I mean, it sort of had such a great impact. So many people died and were restricted of all their rights to the land, to having children and owning their being sort of a first-class citizen in their own country, and that was all taken away. And that could definitely have so many impacts on mental health and ideas of identity and feeling your self-worth, and if your ability to be part of your culture and do all the practices is taken away, I can imagine that takes away your sense of identity, self-worth, and then your mental health will be greatly impacted, I think.
It's not something that just affected the Aboriginal people at that time. It's still affecting Aboriginal people, and it's very present in just in our society.
I could sort of sum that answer up into a sentence. I think that the impact was profound, and I think that from the conversations that I had on the placement, the impact is still being felt throughout the Indigenous population, and it's still hard to measure, I think, too. Talking to individuals, they mentioned again a displacement from land and a disconnection from their community insofar as their traditional lands they can't go home to. They're not able to go there anymore. It's been changed.
What are the barriers to wellbeing and healing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
From the placement and from the conversations that I had is that the barriers largely come down to understanding. Insofar as we, as a sort of our community or the government and white Australia, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, we don't even understand what's wrong, and I don't think that we listen.
In that community, the Aboriginal community that we were at Willum Warrain, there were stories of people who now are there, but who spoke about coming to the car park and just sitting in the car for an hour and then leaving because they were just scared of taking that step and joining that community, wondering whether they will be accepted. So even just in terms of reaching out, there's some barriers of, am I going to be accepted? Will they, what will happen if I reach out? As well as some maybe distrust sometimes for some sort of government, like big government organisations because of what's happened in the past. So they might be scared of going to a GP and saying I'm struggling with this and that because they're scared of what might happen.
How is suffering expressed?
So I think this is quite different depending on the mob and where people are from.
So what I learned that I didn't learn, that I didn't know beforehand is, for example, what they call like sorry business. So different communities express it in different ways, but they generally all do have some sort of way of expressing suffering, especially when someone passes away. So one interesting thing that we learned is that in many communities they don't mention the person's name once they passed away. So that's just one way of showing respect, and so they go through a grieving process but then they don't mention that person's name again. And that's important to know for us because if we have a client who might be going through, a grandparent has passed away, it might be a natural question to maybe ask, what are they called, what was their name? But now we know maybe that they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about that.
It's a different way of expressing suffering. They still talk about it, sort of that fella's brother over there or something like that. So they still keep their spirit alive, but speaking the name of a past one is not respectful for them to pass on.
Also, we heard of some communities, which I found interesting as well. They might, for example, if someone's passed away and they're going through the grieving process, they might have a special hat that they wear, and people wear it for as long as they are grieving. And so if it's someone who passed away that you barely know them, they're just in the community, you might after a day take the hat off and you're ready. But for someone else that might know them more or who might be more affected, they might keep the hat on for longer, and then people see them with the hat and they know that person's still going through that process. They're still maybe suffering from that death. And so I thought that was an interesting thing to learn as well.
What do you see as the role of psychologists in supporting
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's wellbeing?
The first part of that role would be to listen and to find out if we're required. I think that to assume that we as psychologists have a role is presumptuous, and I think it would come down to asking the question, how can we support, and then really listening to the answer.
I think psychologists need to be advocates for basically whatever Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to improve their wellbeing. I think the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians is wrought with just being told what to do, and by non-Aboriginal people, and by a lack of trust as well. So I think it's really, really important that if psychologists genuinely want to help and genuinely care about what's best for these communities, I think we would need to listen and be part of the communities and almost just walk together with these communities to make sure that we're just supporting what their needs are as best as we can.
How do you think the time spent with the Willum Warrain mob will assist with the growth of your professional practice competencies?
So yeah, I think I learned a lot about the culture and sort of their idea of how they view sort of people coming in with help and things like that. And I learned that there were such beautiful people who, they've gone through a lot of things, some of them, but they lean on their community for help and for healing.
I think talking to a number of Aboriginal people and hearing their stories has definitely changed my passion and I guess the sense of urgency to really support Aboriginal communities, and how it's dependent on all Australians to do something, I think. And through spending time with the Willum Warrain mob, I think it helped build that knowledge and also build those communication skills and that understanding of how to work with Aboriginal people in the future.
Understanding just the broader context as well. So we had in my last week there, we had a lecture or a presentation about like treaty and what's happening in that space. So even just understanding what is happening.
There was an assumption, I suppose, that we would go and meet this group of people that wanted our help, and they would tell us exactly how that we could help them, and that would help me to understand how I might engage in a different cultural context. So I think if I was to sort of define it down to one thing that I've learnt, it would be that not to assume that other cultures want our help or are prepared to engage with the psychological paradigms that we operate underneath. Again, I think that's quite presumptuous, and so I suppose that my ability to listen and assume a little bit less has probably grown since doing this placement.
Yeah, I think it's been really beneficial. Yeah, I remember that time fondly, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are they in order?
Yeah, that's it.